The unknown neighbor. I'm a 33-year-old woman, and this is a story I've never shared before. It's been almost a year since I moved into my new place, an old two-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I'd just gone through a rough breakup and was looking for a fresh start, so when I found this house, it seemed perfect. It was peaceful, and I liked the idea of finally having some space of my own. From the first night, though, I started noticing small, odd things. At first, it was just faint sounds outside, things I dismissed as the house settling or maybe the wind. Sometimes I'd find the garden hose in a different position, or the trash can slightly closer to the side gate. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just adjusting to living alone. But then, one morning, I found the back door slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it the night before. That was the first time I felt something wasn't right, but I still managed to convince myself it was nothing. About a week after moving in, I came home from work to find one of my kitchen windows wide open. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks, and a chill ran through me. I knew I'd closed it that morning. I checked every room, but everything was in its place. I wanted to believe I'd just forgotten, but deep down, I knew something was off. That night, I locked every door and window, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few days later, I was out in my front yard, pulling weeds, when I noticed a man standing across the street. He was staring at my house, no smile, no wave, just staring. He looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and an unsettling expression. I tried not to think too much of it, but it left me uneasy. Over the next few days, I started noticing small things again. Items in my house seemed to move ever so slightly, like the remote on the coffee table angled differently, or the kitchen chairs not pushed in all the way. One night, I heard what sounded like footsteps on gravel outside. My heart raced, but every time I looked out the window, I saw nothing. Then, one evening, I saw a shadow move near my front door through the peephole. My first instinct was to open the door and confront whoever it was, but fear rooted me in place. I waited, breath held, until the shadow moved away. When I finally called the police, they did a quick check but found no signs of forced entry or anything suspicious. They suggested it was probably kids playing pranks. I wanted to believe them, but I knew it was something more. Determined not to feel powerless, I installed a basic home security system with a few cameras. I thought it would make me feel safe, and for a few days, it did. I even considered reaching out to the neighbors and introducing myself, but that feeling of relief didn't last. One morning, I woke up and checked the camera footage from the night before. My stomach dropped when I saw a figure walking slowly around my house. The person stopped right outside my bedroom window and just stood there for several minutes before disappearing out of frame. I reported it to the police again, but they told me there wasn't much they could do since the person hadn't tried to enter. They advised me to keep the cameras running and call them if anything else happened. Fear started consuming me. I no longer felt safe in my own home. I stopped going out after dark and even called in sick a few times, afraid to leave the house unattended. One afternoon, I noticed the same man from before watching me again, this time from a different angle, closer to my house. He stood there for what felt like hours before slowly walking away. I tried talking to a few other neighbors about him, but they all seemed indifferent or evasive, like they knew something but didn't want to get involved. That night, after finally managing to fall asleep, I was woken up by a loud bang. My heart pounded as I checked the cameras. The man was back, standing at the edge of my property, staring directly at the camera. It felt like he knew I was watching. Then, he turned and walked away again. I'd had enough. That night, I stayed up, glued to the live camera feed, determined to catch him in the act. Around 2 a.m., I heard the gravel crunching outside. Heart racing, I checked the camera. There he was again, standing closer than ever, staring up at my bedroom window. Anger and fear mixed, and before I could stop myself, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, staring at me, his face blank. I shined the light on him, yelling for him to leave me alone, my voice shaking. But he said nothing, just took a slow step back into the shadows until I couldn't see him anymore. Terrified, I called 911 again, but by the time the police arrived, he was gone. This time, however, they found something chilling. Fresh footprints leading from my front yard all the way up to my bedroom window. The officers advised me to stay with a friend or get a hotel for a few nights while they investigated further. I agreed, but dread settled in. Who was this man? Why was he doing this? I left for a few nights, staying with a friend in the city. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief, but it was fleeting. Every time I checked my phone for camera alerts, my stomach churned. On the last night away, I received an alert. Motion detected at my back door. I pulled up the camera feed but saw nothing. Then, a notification. Camera disconnected. The next morning, I returned home, but everything seemed normal. The police had no leads, and the man hadn't been seen again. For now. I tried to resume my normal life, but the neighborhood didn't feel like home anymore. I'm considering selling the house and moving again, but I don't know if it'll help. One evening, I was closing up for the night when I noticed something on the ground near my bedroom window, a small rusted key. My heart stopped. It was a key for my front door. I stared at it, realizing with a sinking feeling that whoever had been watching me this whole time already had access to my house. I never found out who it was or what they wanted, but I still can't sleep through the night without checking the locks twice. The silent alarm. I've never been a paranoid person. I live alone in a quiet neighborhood, and for years I never worried much about security. But a few months ago, there were a string of break-ins not far from my house. Just hearing about them made me feel uneasy. So, I decided to get a home security system. It seemed like a smart idea, a precaution to give myself some peace of mind. Installing the cameras was easy. I set them up myself, placing one at the front door, one in the living room, and another in the hallway leading to my bedroom. That night, I went to bed feeling more secure than ever. It started with minor alerts. The app would notify me about motion in the yard or at the door. I'd check the footage and see nothing unusual. A shadow from a tree, a stray cat wandering by. But then, one night, I got an alert from the camera in my living room. I opened the app and watched the live feed. Nothing. It was just an empty room. I brushed it off, assuming the camera had picked up something I couldn't see. Then came the night that changed everything. I was out at dinner with a friend when my phone buzzed. It was another motion alert, this time from the hallway camera. I opened the app expecting the usual empty feed, but this time I saw a dark blur at the end of the hall, just out of focus. I stared, waiting for it to move, but it stayed still. Then it disappeared, almost like it had never been there. My heart pounded as I stood up, mumbling some excuse to my friend about needing to leave. I drove home faster than I should have, mind racing with thoughts of someone lurking in my house. When I got there, everything looked normal. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing. It was like I'd imagined it. I tried to convince myself that it was a glitch, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next few days, the alerts kept coming. Motion detected in the living room, the hallway, the front door. I'd rush home every time, only to find my house empty. I stopped sleeping properly. Every time I drifted off, I'd jolt awake, convinced I'd heard something. I tried talking to a friend about it, but they just laughed, saying I was overreacting. Maybe I was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, just outside the frame of the camera. The turning point came one evening when I came home to find the front door slightly ajar. I stood there staring at it, my skin prickling with cold fear. I knew I'd locked it. I always did. I stepped inside, my hands trembling. I searched the house again, every room, every corner, but there was no sign of anyone. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I hadn't locked it after all. Maybe I was just imagining things. But from that night on, the alerts got worse. I'd wake up to find the camera notifications piling up. Each time I checked, it was the same. A brief shadow, a blur, then nothing. One night, after another sleepless evening, I decided to sleep on the couch in the living room. I felt safer there, where I could see the front door. I dozed off, clutching a kitchen knife in my hand, my nerves stretched thin. A loud bang jolted me awake. My heart pounded as I sat up, gripping the knife tighter. The sound had come from my bedroom. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky. Step by step, I crept down the hallway. My house felt foreign, like I was trespassing in someone else's space. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I kept moving. The bedroom door was slightly open. I took a deep breath and pushed it wide. The room was empty, but the closet door was ajar. Slowly, I reached out and pulled it open, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But there was no one inside, just my clothes, hanging silently. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My laptop, which I was sure I'd left in the living room, was now on the bedroom floor. I stared at it, the room spinning. Someone had been in my house. Someone had moved it. I called the police, my voice shaking. They came quickly, but after checking every inch of my house, they found no signs of forced entry. One of the officers suggested, in that patronizing tone they use when they think you're overreacting, that maybe I'd moved it myself and forgotten. I almost snapped at him, but then a thought hit me. Had I? For a split second, I doubted myself. The next day, I felt like a ghost. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. Every creak of the house made me jump. I decided to uninstall the cameras. Maybe if I couldn't see what was happening, I'd stop imagining things. But the fear didn't go away. I quit my job. I couldn't focus on anything except the gnawing thought that someone had been there. Or worse, that they still were. Looking back, I realized something. The doors and windows were always locked, every time, except for that one night. That one night when the front door was open. And I can't be sure, but I think I left it open myself. I sold the house a month later and moved into a small apartment in the city. No cameras, no security systems, just locked doors and windows. I try to tell myself that it was all paranoia, that I let my imagination get the better of me. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up with the feeling that someone's there, just out of sight, watching. Maybe the real horror wasn't someone breaking in. Maybe it was my own mind unraveling. Or maybe it's worse. Maybe someone was really there, and I just never caught them. The jogger's route. I started jogging about 6 months ago to relieve stress from work. It was supposed to be a healthy habit, something to clear my head after long days at the office. I'd always jog around the same park. It's a popular place during the day, filled with families, cyclists, and other joggers. But in the evenings, it's almost deserted. It felt like my own personal retreat, a place I could unwind. For a while, it was perfect. I'd finish work around 6 p.m., change into my running gear, and head out to the park. The route I took was a loop around a small lake, about 2.5 miles. One evening, though, I noticed a man sitting on a bench near the entrance. I didn't think much of it at first. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, looking down at his phone. But over the next week, I realized he was always there, no matter what time I showed up, always sitting on the same bench, in the same position, staring down at his phone. He never looked up at me, never acknowledged me, but his constant presence started to feel unsettling. Even when I changed my routine, sometimes jogging earlier, other times later, he was still there, always on that bench. After a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even if he never made eye contact. I told myself it was just a coincidence. There are lots of regulars at the park, right? But I couldn't help noticing how my skin prickled every time I passed him. One evening, I decided to test my theory. I came much later than usual, around 9 p.m., thinking surely he wouldn't be there this time. But as I rounded the corner to the entrance, there he was. He wasn't sitting this time. He was standing, facing away from the path, hands in his pockets. I jogged past him, pretending not to notice. As I passed, I heard him mutter something. It was too low to make out the words, but the tone sent shivers down my spine. That night, I went home and locked every window and door in my apartment, a habit I never had before. As I was double-checking my bedroom window, I thought I saw a shadow move outside. I blinked and looked again, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of my empty backyard. I started questioning my sanity after that. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I'd watched too many true crime documentaries. To ease my mind, I decided to change my jogging route entirely. I picked a different park on the other side of town and switched to morning jogs instead. It worked, for 2 days. On the third morning, I was halfway through my new route when I saw him. He was walking towards me, head down, like he didn't see me at all. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep going. It's just another coincidence, I told myself. He's probably a resident of the area, maybe just out for his own walk. I passed him, holding my breath. He didn't even glance at me. Determined to feel in control again, I switched to even earlier runs, starting at 5 a.m. But the next morning, as I crossed a quiet street near the park, I saw him again. This time, he was standing across the road, still, and watching me. It was like he knew exactly where I would be. I decided enough was enough. I walked towards him, my heart pounding, but before I could say anything, he turned and walked away. I reported him to the police that day. They told me there wasn't much they could do without a clear threat. I went home feeling exposed and helpless. That night, I found a piece of paper slipped under my front door. It was completely blank, except for a faint, smudged fingerprint in the corner. I stared at it for what felt like hours. I knew it was from him. But what was it supposed to mean? A warning? A taunt? I couldn't live like this anymore. I started missing work, too afraid to leave my apartment. I installed a security camera outside my door. A few days later, the camera alerted me to movement in the hallway. I checked the footage, and there he was, standing outside my door for a few whole minutes before walking away. I decided to leave town and stay with a friend. That night, as I packed my things, I heard a soft scraping sound from the hallway. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Then, a loud knock. I jumped back, my hand trembling as I reached for my phone to dial 911. Before the call could connect, I heard a voice, a woman's voice, asking if I was okay. It was my neighbor. Trembling, I opened the door a crack. She was holding a package that had been left outside. When I took it from her, I noticed she was looking at me strangely, like she could see the panic on my face. I thanked her and shut the door quickly. I opened the package with shaky hands. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short message written in neat, blocky letters. See you soon. I left that night. Stayed with my friend for weeks, refusing to go out alone. The police said they'd keep an eye out, but without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Eventually, the man seemed to vanish. There were no more strange encounters, no more notes. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I saw a man on a bench or heard footsteps behind me, my throat would tighten. I considered moving to a new city, changing my name, anything to escape. But would it even matter? I'd never know if he was still watching or if I was just imagining things. Then, a few nights ago, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered, and there was silence on the other end. Just when I was about to hang up, I heard it. A familiar voice whispering, "Miss me?" I deleted all my social media after that, changed my number. I'm trying to erase every trace of myself, hoping to disappear. But the fear won't leave. I don't know if he's still out there or if it's all in my head now. Every time I hear footsteps behind me, I feel the same dread I did back at the park. So, if you're reading this, be careful when you think you're safe. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that don't leave. The Hidden Room. I've been following this sub for a while now, but never thought I'd have something to contribute. I wish I didn't. My partner and I recently bought an old house in a quiet town. It's one of those 1920s properties that people think of as full of character, but really, it's just run down. The previous owners sold it to us for dirt cheap, so we jumped at the opportunity, even though they left it in pretty bad shape. Looking back, I should have questioned why they left so abruptly, but at the time, I thought it was just a lucky break. When we first moved in, I brushed off the little oddities, creaking floors, weird placement of old furniture, and a faint smell of mold in some rooms. Just quirks of an old house, right? It wasn't until I started cleaning that I found something strange. A stack of old black and white photographs behind a loose floorboard in one of the bedrooms. Most of the photos showed the house's interior decades ago, but there was one that made my stomach turn. It was of the basement, but in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, there was a figure. Someone standing there watching. I felt uneasy, but I didn't mention it to my partner, figuring it was probably just a trick of the light. We decided to tackle the basement first during renovations. It was dingy and unfinished, and I wanted to turn it into a workshop. That's when we noticed something weird. One of the walls seemed newer than the others. The concrete was a different shade, the surface smoother, as if it had been put up recently. "Should we check it out?" my partner asked, her voice shaky. I could tell she wanted to leave it alone, but I couldn't let it go. We grabbed some tools and started chipping away at the wall. After about an hour, we broke through, and behind it, there was a room. It was small, maybe 8 by 8 feet, but what was inside made my blood run cold. Rusty chains bolted to the floor, a rotting mattress with dark stains, and a stack of Polaroid photos. Each photo showed people tied up and blindfolded, positioned right where we were standing. The faces were blurred, but the fear in their body language was unmistakable. My partner backed away. "We need to leave. Now." But I was frozen. "Wait, what's this?" I picked up an old notebook from a dusty corner. Inside were cryptic notes and a list of names. Some were crossed out, others circled. One name caught my eye: David Trent. I remembered seeing a flyer for a missing person named David Trent in town last week. We left the basement in a rush and tried calling the real estate agent who sold us the house, but we were told she no longer worked there. They didn't have any forwarding information either. My heart started racing. We went to the police station and showed the officer on duty the notebook and photos. At first, he seemed dismissive, as if I was wasting his time. But when I spread the Polaroids across his desk, his expression changed. He leaned forward, examining them closely, and then said he'd send a patrol car to check it out. When the police arrived, the hidden room was gone. The wall was back up as if we'd never touched it, and everything inside had vanished. No chains, no mattress, No photos. The officer looked at me like I was insane. Sir, are you sure you're not imagining this? Maybe the stress of moving has been getting to you. I looked at my partner for support, but she just stared at the ground. Maybe, maybe we should talk to someone, she whispered later. A professional. I think you're seeing things. I wanted to believe she was wrong, but when I went back to the basement alone that evening, I noticed faint scratch marks on the concrete floor, right where the chains had been. And that smell, the metallic, almost blood-like scent, was still in the air. That night, I got a call from an unknown number. When I picked up, a voice whispered, "Why did you break the wall?" My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would burst. The line went dead before I could respond. The next day, I dug into the house's history. Multiple families had owned it over the past few decades, and almost all of them had disappeared without a trace. I confronted my partner, and she finally broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. My family, we used to own this place. I didn't want to tell you. I thought it was over. What are you talking about? I demanded. She explained in a halting, shaky voice. People had been brought here, taken to that room. She didn't know why or by whom, but it was a dark family secret that her parents warned her to never speak of. I thought if we just stayed away from the basement, we'd be fine. We decided to leave the house, but just as we were packing, there was a knock at the door. A woman was standing at the end of our driveway. It was the real estate agent. She was smiling, holding a set of keys. "Leaving so soon?" she asked softly. "But the house isn't finished with you yet." I felt paralyzed. My partner started muttering, "We shouldn't have touched the room. We shouldn't have..." The real estate agent held up the notebook I thought had vanished. It was blank except for one new name written on the first page. Mine. Now I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. Every time we try to leave, something stops us. Locked doors, missing keys, and strange people showing up at our doorstep asking if the room is still accessible. At night, I hear tapping noises coming from the basement. Slow, rhythmic, almost like someone is trying to get out. I know I should go down there and check, but I'm too scared. If you don't hear from me again, don't come looking for me. Just don't buy this house. Title: The Public Restroom. Encounter: A real-life horror story. I've always been a cautious person, but I've never thought of myself as paranoid. I'm the kind of woman who double-checks her locks at night and keeps pepper spray in her purse. So, when I decided to take a solo road trip as a break from work and everything else in my life, I planned every detail. I even preferred driving at night because the empty roads let me think. The trip had been mostly uneventful until I stopped at a gas station earlier that day. I had that odd feeling that someone was watching me. You know, that prickling sensation at the back of your neck. I noticed a man staring as I filled up my car. He was leaning against his truck, eyes fixed on me. I brushed it off as nothing more than an awkward encounter, but the discomfort lingered. Hours later, I found myself on a long, desolate stretch of highway. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a car trailing me at a distance. It followed for a few miles before suddenly veering off onto another road. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept driving until I couldn't ignore my growing need to use the restroom. The only option was a remote rest area off the highway. It was well lit, and I reminded myself that it was a public space, meant for travelers. I parked, hesitating for a moment, but then decided it was safe enough. I grabbed my keys and phone, just in case. Inside, the restroom was empty and dead silent. I quickly did my business, eager to get back on the road. While washing my hands, I heard a faint click behind me. I looked up and saw a crack in the door of one of the stalls. That's when I noticed it. A single eye peering through the gap, staring right at me. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, unsure of what to do. Was it a mistake? Was someone just looking to see if the restroom was occupied? But the eye didn't blink. It stayed there, fixed on me. I felt sweat bead on my forehead, and I tried to calm myself. Maybe it's just some weirdo pulling a prank, I thought. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. The eye shifted slightly. Then, almost cheerfully, a voice replied, "Hello." My stomach twisted in fear. I took a step back, glancing around for an exit. There was only one way out. The same door I came in through, right next to that stall. My mind raced. If I tried to make a run for it, would he come out? What was he even doing? I decided to move slowly, trying not to make any sudden noises. I turned off the tap and, with measured steps, edged toward the door. I could feel his gaze following me, but I kept going. When I was just a few feet away, the stall door swung open. A man stepped out, blocking my path. He was tall and disheveled, his face twisted into an unsettling grin. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at me. I noticed something shiny in his hand, a small pocket knife. Panic surged through me. My only thought was to get out of there. I sprinted for the door, expecting him to lunge at me, but he didn't move. I burst outside, heart hammering in my chest, and dashed to my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and looked back at the restroom entrance. He was standing there, looking at me through the glass. My initial relief faded when I saw him pull out his phone and jot something down. It took a second for the realization to hit. He was memorizing my license plate number. My hands shook as I started the car, speeding out of the lot. I barely made it a mile down the road when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. "Unknown number, nice car, I'll see you soon." I almost swerved off the road in shock. My heart raced as I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, a wave of nausea washing over me. I drove for what felt like hours, constantly checking my mirrors. For a long stretch, there were no headlights behind me, and I started to think maybe I'd lost him. But then, a dark silhouette appeared in my rearview mirror. No headlights, just a shadow trailing me closely. Panic flared again. It could be anyone, I told myself. But the car stayed on me, matching my speed. I sped up, and so did it. I tried to calm myself, but my hands were trembling on the wheel. I veered onto an exit ramp, hoping to lose him, but he swerved sharply to follow. My throat tightened as I realized he was hunting me. My gas was running low, and I had no idea where I was. Desperate, I turned off the highway into a small, deserted town. The car behind me vanished into the darkness. I pulled into a convenience store's parking lot, my body shaking uncontrollably. My gas gauge was almost on empty. The store's lights flickered. I glanced around, praying I was alone, when I saw him. He stepped out of the shadows, that same eerie smile on his face. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call the police. No signal. He didn't approach me, just stood by the entrance, watching me. That grin slowly spread wider. I felt trapped. I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, a truck pulled into the lot. The man's smile faded, replaced with a look of annoyance. He turned and casually walked away, disappearing behind the store. I watched, terrified and confused. The truck driver got out, giving me a concerned look. "You okay, miss?" I nodded, but I knew I wasn't. I'd never be okay again. I reported everything to the local police, but they dismissed it, said there wasn't much they could do. I cut my trip short and drove straight home. But for weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I had nightmares, woke up in a cold sweat, convinced he'd be standing outside my window. And then, one day, I saw it. A familiar car parked outside my office building. My heart dropped when I noticed a note on my windshield. I told you I'd see you soon. I haven't seen him again since, but I know he's still out there, watching, waiting. The hotel room. I travel a lot for work. Conferences, client meetings, hotels have become my second home. I usually don't mind. I've got my routine down. Check in, unpack just enough to keep things organized, set up my laptop, and settle in. This time was no different. I had a conference to attend, and I booked a mid-tier hotel close to the venue. It seemed fine at first. Clean room, decent amenities. But right from the beginning, something felt off. It's hard to explain. Maybe it was the stale, musty smell that lingered in the air like the room hadn't been used in a while, or the way the light seemed too dim, even with all the lamps turned on. The layout of the room was just a bit strange, too. The bed was positioned at an angle that made me feel like I was being watched, but it was nothing serious, just a weird vibe. That night, as I unpacked, I noticed a drawer was slightly open. I didn't remember opening it, but I brushed it off. Maybe I'd knocked it while putting away my clothes. I shut it and tried to forget about it, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The next day, after a long, draining day at the conference, I came back to my room, ready to unwind. As soon as I stepped in, I noticed the window was open. I was sure I'd closed it before I left. I even remembered double-checking because I didn't want the noise from the street below. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe housekeeping had aired out the room or something. That night, I woke up to the sound of the TV turning on. I jolted awake, my heart racing. The screen glowed softly in the dark, the volume set just low enough to be a murmur. I grabbed the remote and turned it off, my hands trembling. I checked it over. No issues, batteries secure. There was no reason for it to turn on by itself. I tried to go back to sleep, but I kept replaying the events in my head. I felt like I was losing it. Did I forget to turn the TV off before bed? Did I leave the window open? The next morning, I found my suitcase shifted a few inches from where I'd left it. Now I knew something was off. I wedged a small piece of paper in the doorframe before heading out that day. A crude way to check if someone was entering my room, but I had to be sure. When I came back in the evening, the paper was on the floor. My heart dropped. I stepped in cautiously, feeling my pulse hammering in my throat. Everything looked normal, except for a pen missing from the desk. I knew it had been there in the morning because I used it to jot down some notes. My laptop was shifted slightly too. The fear that someone was entering my room, someone who wasn't supposed to, was almost paralyzing. I considered calling the front desk but held back. What would I say? Hey, I think someone's moving my stuff around. I'd sound insane. Instead, I set up a trap. A water bottle balanced precariously on the doorknob. If anyone turned it, it would fall. I left for dinner, forcing myself to stay out for a couple of hours, even though I couldn't think about anything but that water bottle. I came back, bracing myself as I opened the door. The bottle was on the floor. The bed looked slightly rumpled, like someone had sat on it. Panic gripped me. I checked the room thoroughly, but there was no one there. No signs of forced entry. The deadbolt was locked. I started doubting my sanity. Maybe I was doing these things and forgetting. Maybe I was just overtired. I finally decided to confront the hotel staff. The manager assured me that no one had entered my room besides housekeeping. No reports of strange activity. He offered to switch my room, but I declined. I was too unnerved to pack up in the middle of the night. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak and groan made me jump. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the quiet hum of the air conditioner amplifying the silence. Around 3 a.m., I heard the doorknob jiggle softly. I froze, barely breathing. The handle stopped. I waited, straining to hear any sound. Then I heard the faint shuffle of footsteps outside, moving away. I leapt out of bed and swung the door open, peering into the empty hallway. The stairwell door at the inn was closing slowly, as if someone had just gone through. I ran down the hall and pushed open the door. No one was there, but the air was thick with the same musty smell from my room. My skin crawled. I went to the front desk the next morning and demanded to see the security footage. The grainy video showed a member of the cleaning staff entering my room while I was out. He didn't take anything. Instead, he walked around, touched my laptop, sat on the bed, and stared at the TV screen, off, before turning it on. He lingered, just standing there, watching. I felt sick. He was in my room for almost half an hour each time, doing nothing but just being there. The manager apologized profusely, said the guy would be fired immediately, offered me free nights, anything to make it right. I nodded, but I didn't feel any relief. I moved to a different room, but I still couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back. Why did he stay so long? Why only my room? The next morning, as I was checking out, I saw a maid cart parked near my door. I caught a flash of movement. He was there, the same man from the footage. He looked at me, no expression on his face, before turning and walking away. I left that hotel, but the unease followed me home. I tried to convince myself it was over, but I started noticing small things out of place in my apartment. A drawer left open, the TV on when I was sure I turned it off. I told myself it was paranoia. But sometimes, at night, I think I see that man's reflection in my window. But when I turn on the light, there's no one there. The Lost Hiker's Guide. I love hiking. It's my way of escaping the chaos of city life and finding peace in nature. I'm not a complete novice. I've been on a few trails and I know how to navigate using a map and compass. That's why, when I decided to take a solo hike on a lesser-known trail I found online, I felt confident. The trail description was vague, but the photos showed a beautiful forest path with breathtaking viewpoints. When I arrived at the trailhead, I felt a slight unease. The parking lot was completely empty, and the air felt heavy and still. There was a weathered sign warning to stay on marked paths due to previous incidents of hikers getting lost. But it was an old sign, probably outdated. I brushed off my discomfort and set off, eager to lose myself in the tranquility of the forest. About a mile in, I noticed something odd. A small arrow, hand-carved into the bark of a tree, pointed off to the right. It wasn't an official trail marker, but I thought it might have been left by another hiker as a shortcut. I decided to follow it, curiosity outweighing caution. After all, I had my phone's GPS, and the sun was still high in the sky. As I continued, I saw more of these carvings, leading me deeper into the woods. They were placed at irregular intervals, sometimes close together, sometimes spaced far apart. The trail became less defined, the trees grew thicker, and soon I realized I hadn't seen any official markers for a while. I was beginning to feel uneasy again. The forest was too quiet, and the shadows were getting longer. When I decided to turn back, I realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't find the way I'd come. Panicking, I retraced my steps, trying to remember the sequence of turns I took. That's when I noticed something chilling. One of the carvings now had a piece of cloth tied around it. A small scrap, torn and frayed, but unmistakably the same color as my backpack. It was fresh, almost as if someone had just tied it there. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it must have been there all along and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew someone was out there, watching me. I started to walk faster, trying to ignore the mounting fear. But every time I thought I was heading back, I'd find myself confronted by yet another unfamiliar carving. They seemed newer, sharper, almost taunting me. I stumbled into a small clearing, my heart pounding, only to find a half-buried old backpack lying there. Its contents were scattered: rusted utensils, faded maps, and a water bottle with greenish mold inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It looked like it had been there for years, abandoned by someone who never made it out. The silence around me was suffocating. Then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I froze, convinced I was imagining things. But then it came again, louder, closer. It sounded like my own voice, distorted and strained. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The voice called again, and I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. Whoever it was, they knew my name. They had been watching me. I backed away slowly, trying to think rationally. I shouldn't call out. I shouldn't make a sound. I needed to get away, but where? Every direction looked the same. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move quietly, step by step, away from the clearing. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. My legs felt weak, and my head spun as if I were in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I thought I saw movement between the trees, a flash of something pale and human-shaped, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. Suddenly, I found myself in another clearing, and the voice came again, this time from right behind me. I turned, and there he was. A man in hiking gear, standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were cold, and he wore a twisted smile that didn't reach them. He didn't say a word, just raised his hand and gestured for me to follow. My body screamed no, but my legs moved on their own. I kept my distance, thinking maybe, just maybe, he could lead me back to the main path. But he never looked back, never slowed down. I don't know how long I followed him, minutes, hours. It all blurred together. Suddenly, I lost sight of him behind a bend. When I rounded the corner, I found myself back in the same clearing with the abandoned backpack. It was as if I'd been walking in circles. Panic surged through me, and I started running blindly. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I could hear the voice again, but now it was joined by others. Some whispering, others shouting my name, all blending into a cacophony of terror. I ran until I collapsed, gasping for air, my body trembling. The voices stopped. I was alone. I looked up and saw a faint light through the trees. I stumbled toward it, praying it wasn't another trap. It was a small ranger's cabin. I burst inside, sobbing, trying to explain what happened. The ranger looked at me like I was crazy, insisting no one else had been out on that trail in months. He promised to get me help and sat me down with a glass of water. As I waited, I noticed a map on the wall. The area I had been wandering in was marked as off-limits, with several red X's scattered around. Missing hikers, all gone in the same part of the forest. The ranger quickly folded up the map when he saw me looking, his expression tight. The next morning, a group of rangers escorted me back to my car. One of them muttered, "He didn't show up this time." But when I asked what they meant, they just shook their heads. Before I left, one ranger slipped me a note. It was a piece of paper with my name and a carved arrow pointing right, just like the ones I saw on the trees. I never went back, but I still hear that voice in my dreams, calling my name, drawing me back to the forest. I'm scared that one day I won't be able to resist. The Lost Hiker's Guide. I love hiking. It's my way of escaping the chaos of city life and finding peace in nature. I'm not a complete novice. I've been on a few trails, and I know how to navigate using a map and compass. That's why, when I decided to take a solo hike on a lesser-known trail I found online, I felt confident. The trail description was vague, but the photos showed a beautiful forest path with breathtaking viewpoints. When I arrived at the trailhead, I felt a slight unease. The parking lot was completely empty, and the air felt heavy and still. There was a weathered sign warning to stay on marked paths due to previous incidents of hikers getting lost. But it was an old sign, probably outdated. I brushed off my discomfort and set off, eager to lose myself in the tranquility of the forest. About a mile in, I noticed something odd. A small arrow, hand carved into the bark of a tree, pointed off to the right. It wasn't an official trail marker, but I thought it might have been left by another hiker as a shortcut. I decided to follow it, curiosity outweighing caution. After all, I had my phone's GPS, and the sun was still high in the sky. As I continued, I saw more of these carvings, leading me deeper into the woods. They were placed at irregular intervals, sometimes close together, sometimes spaced far apart. The trail became less defined, the trees grew thicker, and soon I realized I hadn't seen any official markers for a while. I was beginning to feel uneasy again. The forest was too quiet, and the shadows were getting longer. When I decided to turn back, I realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't find the way I'd come. Panicking, I retraced my steps, trying to remember the sequence of turns I took. That's when I noticed something chilling. One of the carvings now had a piece of cloth tied around it, a small scrap torn and frayed, but unmistakably the same color as my backpack. It was fresh, almost as if someone had just tied it there. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it must have been there all along and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew someone was out there, watching me. I started to walk faster, trying to ignore the mounting fear. But every time I thought I was heading back, I'd find myself confronted by yet another unfamiliar carving. They seemed newer, sharper, almost taunting me. I stumbled into a small clearing, my heart pounding, only to find a half-buried old backpack lying there. Its contents were scattered, rusted utensils, faded maps, and a water bottle with greenish mold inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It looked like it had been there for years, abandoned by someone who never made it out. The silence around me was suffocating. Then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I froze, convinced I was imagining things. But then it came again, louder, closer. It sounded like my own voice, distorted and strained. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The voice called again, and I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. Whoever it was, they knew my name. They had been watching me. I backed away slowly, trying to think rationally. I shouldn't call out. I shouldn't make a sound. I needed to get away, but where? Every direction looked the same. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move quietly, step by step, away from the clearing. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. My legs felt weak, and my head spun as if I were in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I thought I saw movement between the trees, a flash of something pale and human-shaped, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. Suddenly, I found myself in another clearing, and the voice came again, this time from right behind me. I turned, and there he was. A man in hiking gear, standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were cold, and he wore a twisted smile that didn't reach them. He didn't say a word, just raised his hand and gestured for me to follow. My body screamed, no, but my legs moved on their own. I kept my distance, thinking maybe, just maybe, he could lead me back to the main path. But he never looked back, never slowed down. I don't know how long I followed him. Minutes, hours. It all blurred together. Suddenly, I lost sight of him behind a bend. When I rounded the corner, I found myself back in the same clearing with the abandoned backpack. It was as if I'd been walking in circles. Panic surged through me, and I started running blindly. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I could hear the voice again, but now it was joined by others. Some whispering, others shouting my name, all blending into a cacophony of terror. I ran until I collapsed, gasping for air, my body trembling. The voices stopped. I was alone. I looked up and saw a faint light through the trees. I stumbled toward it, praying it wasn't another trap. It was a small ranger's cabin. I burst inside, sobbing, trying to explain what happened. The ranger looked at me like I was crazy, insisting no one else had been out on that trail in months. He promised to get me help and sat me down with a glass of water. As I waited, I noticed a map on the wall. The area I had been wandering in was marked as off-limits, with several red X's scattered around. Missing hikers, all gone in the same part of the forest. The ranger quickly folded up the map when he saw me looking, his expression tight. The next morning, a group of rangers escorted me back to my car. One of them muttered, "He didn't show up this time." But when I asked what they meant, they just shook their heads. Before I left, one ranger slipped me a note. It was a piece of paper with my name and a carved arrow pointing right, just like the ones I saw on the trees. I never went back, but I still hear that voice in my dreams calling my name, drawing me back to the forest. I'm scared that one day I won't be able to resist. The Lost Hiker's Guide. I love hiking. It's my way of escaping the chaos of city life and finding peace in nature. I'm not a complete novice. I've been on a few trails, and I know how to navigate using a map and compass. That's why, when I decided to take a solo hike on a lesser-known trail I found online, I felt confident. The trail description was vague, but the photos showed a beautiful forest path with breathtaking viewpoints. When I arrived at the trailhead, I felt a slight unease. The parking lot was completely empty, and the air felt heavy and still. There was a weathered sign warning to stay on marked paths due to previous incidents of hikers getting lost. But it was an old sign, probably outdated. I brushed off my discomfort and set off, eager to lose myself in the tranquility of the forest. About a mile in, I noticed something odd. A small arrow, hand-carved into the bark of a tree, pointed off to the right. It wasn't an official trail marker, but I thought it might have been left by another hiker as a shortcut. I decided to follow it, curiosity outweighing caution. After all, I had my phone's GPS, and the sun was still high in the sky. As I continued, I saw more of these carvings, leading me deeper into the woods. They were placed at irregular intervals, sometimes close together, sometimes spaced far apart. The trail became less defined, the trees grew thicker, and soon I realized I hadn't seen any official markers for a while. I was beginning to feel uneasy again. The forest was too quiet, and the shadows were getting longer. When I decided to turn back, I realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't find the way I'd come. Panicking, I retraced my steps, trying to remember the sequence of turns I took. That's when I noticed something chilling. One of the carvings now had a piece of cloth tied around it. A small scrap, torn and frayed, but unmistakably the same color as my backpack. It was fresh, almost as if someone had just tied it there. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it must have been there all along and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew someone was out there, watching me. I started to walk faster, trying to ignore the mounting fear, but every time I thought I was heading back, I'd find myself confronted by yet another unfamiliar carving. They seemed newer, sharper, almost taunting me. I stumbled into a small clearing, my heart pounding, only to find a half-buried old backpack lying there. Its contents were scattered, rusted utensils, faded maps, and a water bottle with greenish mold inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It looked like it had been there for years, abandoned by someone who never made it out. The silence around me was suffocating. Then, I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I froze, convinced I was imagining things. But then it came again, louder, closer. It sounded like my own voice, distorted and strained. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The voice called again, and I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. Whoever it was, they knew my name. They had been watching me. I backed away slowly, trying to think rationally. I shouldn't call out. I shouldn't make a sound. I needed to get away. But where? Every direction looked the same. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move quietly, step by step, away from the clearing. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. My legs felt weak, and my head spun as if I were in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I thought I saw movement between the trees, a flash of something pale and human-shaped, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. Suddenly, I found myself in another clearing, and the voice came again, this time from right behind me. I turned, and there he was. A man in hiking gear, standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were cold, and he wore a twisted smile that didn't reach them. He didn't say a word, just raised his hand and gestured for me to follow. My body screamed no, but my legs moved on their own. I kept my distance, thinking maybe, just maybe, he could lead me back to the main path. But he never looked back, never slowed down. I don't know how long I followed him, minutes, hours. It all blurred together. Suddenly, I lost sight of him behind a bend. When I rounded the corner, I found myself back in the same clearing with the abandoned backpack. It was as if I'd been walking in circles. Panic surged through me, and I started running blindly. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I could hear the voice again, but now it was joined by others. Some whispering, others shouting my name, all blending into a cacophony of terror. I ran until I collapsed, gasping for air, my body trembling. The voices stopped. I was alone. I looked up and saw a faint light through the trees. I stumbled toward it, praying it wasn't another trap. It was a small ranger's cabin. I burst inside, sobbing, trying to explain what happened. The ranger looked at me like I was crazy, insisting no one else had been out on that trail in months. He promised to get me help and sat me down with a glass of water. As I waited, I noticed a map on the wall. The area I had been wandering in was marked as off-limits, with several red X's scattered around. Missing hikers, all gone in the same part of the forest. The ranger quickly folded up the map when he saw me looking, his expression tight. The next morning, a group of rangers escorted me back to my car. One of them muttered, "He didn't show up this time." But when I asked what they meant, they just shook their heads. Before I left, one ranger slipped me a note. It was a piece of paper with my name and a carved arrow pointing right, just like the ones I saw on the trees. I never went back, but I still hear that voice in my dreams calling my name, drawing me back to the forest. I'm scared that one day I won't be able to resist. The Lost Hiker's Guide. I love hiking. It's my way of escaping the chaos of city life and finding peace in nature. I'm not a complete novice. I've been on a few trails, and I know how to navigate using a map and compass. That's why, when I decided to take a solo hike on a lesser-known trail I found online, I felt confident. The trail description was vague, but the photos showed a beautiful forest path with breathtaking viewpoints. When I arrived at the trailhead, I felt a slight unease. The parking lot was completely empty, and the air felt heavy and still. There was a weathered sign warning to stay on marked paths due to previous incidents of hikers getting lost. But it was an old sign, probably outdated. I brushed off my discomfort and set off, eager to lose myself in the tranquility of the forest. About a mile in, I noticed something odd. A small arrow, hand carved into the bark of a tree, pointed off to the right. It wasn't an official trail marker, but I thought it might have been left by another hiker as a shortcut. I decided to follow it, curiosity outweighing caution. After all, I had my phone's GPS, and the sun was still high in the sky. As I continued, I saw more of these carvings, leading me deeper into the woods. They were placed at irregular intervals, sometimes close together, sometimes spaced far apart. The trail became less defined, the trees grew thicker, and soon I realized I hadn't seen any official markers for a while. I was beginning to feel uneasy again. The forest was too quiet, and the shadows were getting longer. When I decided to turn back, I realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't find the way I'd come. Panicking, I retraced my steps, trying to remember the sequence of turns I took. That's when I noticed something chilling. One of the carvings now had a piece of cloth tied around it. A small scrap, torn and frayed, but unmistakably the same color as my backpack. It was fresh, almost as if someone had just tied it there. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it must have been there all along and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew someone was out there, watching me. I started to walk faster, trying to ignore the mounting fear. But every time I thought I was heading back, I'd find myself confronted by yet another unfamiliar carving. They seemed newer, sharper, almost taunting me. I stumbled into a small clearing, my heart pounding, only to find a half-buried, old backpack lying there. Its contents were scattered, rusted utensils, faded maps, and a water bottle with greenish mold inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It looked like it had been there for years, abandoned by someone who never made it out. The silence around me was suffocating. Then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I froze, convinced I was imagining things. But then it came again, louder, closer. It sounded like my own voice, distorted and strained. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The voice called again, and I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. Whoever it was, they knew my name. They had been watching me. I backed away slowly, trying to think rationally. I shouldn't call out. I shouldn't make a sound. I needed to get away, but where? Every direction looked the same. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move quietly, step by step, away from the clearing. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. My legs felt weak, and my head spun as if I were in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I thought I saw movement between the trees, a flash of something pale and human-shaped, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. Suddenly, I found myself in another clearing, and the voice came again, this time from right behind me. I turned, and there he was, a man in hiking gear standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were cold, and he wore a twisted smile that didn't reach them. He didn't say a word, just raised his hand and gestured for me to follow. My body screamed no, but my legs moved on their own. I kept my distance, thinking maybe, just maybe, he could lead me back to the main path. But he never looked back, never slowed down. I don't know how long I followed him, minutes, hours. It all blurred together. Suddenly, I lost sight of him behind a bend. When I rounded the corner, I found myself back in the same clearing with the abandoned backpack. It was as if I'd been walking in circles. Panic surged through me, and I started running blindly. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I could hear the voice again, but now it was joined by others, some whispering, others shouting my name, all blending into a cacophony of terror. I ran until I collapsed, gasping for air, my body trembling. The voices stopped. I was alone. I looked up and saw a faint light through the trees. I stumbled toward it, praying it wasn't another trap. It was a small ranger's cabin. I burst inside, sobbing, trying to explain what happened. The ranger looked at me like I was crazy, insisting no one else had been out on that trail in months. He promised to get me help and sat me down with a glass of water. As I waited, I noticed a map on the wall. The area I had been wandering in was marked as off-limits, with several red X's scattered around. Missing hikers, all gone in the same part of the forest. The ranger quickly folded up the map when he saw me looking, his expression tight. The next morning, a group of rangers escorted me back to my car. One of them muttered, "He didn't show up this time." But when I asked what they meant, they just shook their heads. Before I left, one ranger slipped me a note. It was a piece of paper with my name and a carved arrow pointing right, just like the ones I saw on the trees. I never went back, but I still hear that voice in my dreams calling my name, drawing me back to the forest. I'm scared that one day I won't be able to resist. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. I know this might sound like something out of a cheap horror movie, but I promise it's real. My name is Sarah, and I'm a 32-year-old real estate agent. I travel a lot for work, usually on lonely roads at odd hours. I've always been skeptical about ghost stories and the supernatural, but something happened to me last month that I can't explain. It's been haunting me ever since. It started late one night, after a long day showing properties in a remote town. I was driving back home on a 2-lane highway, surrounded by thick woods on both sides. It's the kind of road where your car's headlights are the only source of light, and the silence feels heavy. I remember passing an empty car on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly. There was no one inside, and the door was slightly ajar, which felt odd, but I didn't stop to check. I've driven that road countless times, but that night felt different. There was something unsettling in the air, like the darkness was pressing in around me. I kept seeing headlights in the distance behind me, then they'd disappear, only to reappear a few minutes later. I brushed it off as another car being cautious, but it added to the tension. Then I saw her, a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. It was a young girl, maybe 15 or 16, wearing a hooded jacket. She was standing so still, facing the road as if she'd been waiting for me. I hesitated. It's not like me to pick up hitchhikers, but it was late, and she looked so vulnerable. Guilt tugged at me, and before I could think it through, I pulled over. "Do you need a ride?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. She didn't answer, but walked over and got into the back seat. I felt a chill as she settled in. Something about her presence was off, too quiet, too muted. I glanced at her through the rearview mirror. She kept her head down, hood covering her face, hands resting stiffly on her knees. I tried to break the silence. "Are you okay? Where are you headed?" Nothing. Just a slight shift, like she was acknowledging I'd spoken but didn't want to reply. I forced myself to keep talking, hoping to ease the tension. "It's late. You shouldn't be out here alone." Still no response. Just silence. The kind that makes your skin crawl. I turned up the radio to fill the emptiness, but it only made things worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I started to notice things. I couldn't hear her breathing, and when I glanced back, it felt like she was blending into the shadows, like she wasn't really there. I thought about stopping the car and asking her to leave, but my hands wouldn't move from the steering wheel. My heart was racing. Just when I decided I needed to do something, my car began to sputter. Not now, please, not now, I muttered, steering to the side of the road as the engine died. I took a deep breath, turned to apologize to the girl, and the back seat was empty. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the car shift. She was just gone. Panic surged through me. I jumped out of the car, scanning the area with my phone's flashlight. There were no footprints, no rustling in the bushes, just darkness and the faint sound of wind in the trees. I climbed back into the car, locked the doors, and tried to convince myself she must have run off. But there was no trace of her, and that dread was still there, thickening with each second. I tried starting the car again, but the engine just sputtered. Come on, I whispered desperately. Then I heard it, a faint knock on the passenger window. I froze, staring straight ahead, not daring to turn. The knocking came again, softer this time, almost like a gentle tapping. When I finally looked, there was nothing. Just my reflection, pale and terrified. The car roared to life suddenly, and I didn't waste a second. I sped down the road, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I was shaking, but I told myself I'd go to the police. Tell them what? That I picked up a girl who disappeared? They'd think I was crazy. A few minutes later, headlights appeared behind me, blindingly bright. The car was tailing me closely, flashing its lights as if signaling me to stop. I pressed down on the gas pedal, my pulse racing, but the car kept up, its headlights glaring through my windows. I wanted to pull over, but fear kept me going. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car vanished. I looked around frantically. There was no turnoff, no place it could have gone. It was just gone. My hands were trembling as I gripped the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my blood turned to ice. The girl was there, sitting in the back seat, her face pale and expressionless. I swerved, nearly losing control. When I looked back, she was gone. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, I was a wreck. I pulled into a gas station and broke down crying. The clerk and a few customers stared at me, but I didn't care. I considered calling the police, but how could I explain any of this? I just wanted to go home. As I got back into the car, something caught my eye. A small handprint on the fogged-up glass of the back window. My breath hitched. I wiped it away with shaking fingers and drove off, trying to tell myself it was just condensation. The next day, I heard a news report about a missing girl. They described her as last seen wearing a hooded jacket, and I felt sick to my stomach. It was right where I'd picked her up, but I didn't go to the police. What could I say? I hadn't seen her since, but sometimes when I'm driving alone, I still see her, standing at the edge of the road or in my rearview mirror. I sold the car, thought it might help. But last night, I found a new handprint on the back window of my new car. The same size, the same shape. I don't know what to think anymore. Title: The Stranded Driver. I'm not really sure how to start this. I guess I just want to share what happened to me a few weeks ago, and maybe someone here can make sense of it. I'd been going through a rough patch. Recently divorced, no kids, nothing really holding me back. So I took off on an aimless road trip to clear my head. The kind of drive where you don't really know where you're going and don't care. It was around midnight and I was on this long stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. I'd been avoiding the highways, sticking to these deserted back roads where it felt like I was the only person left on Earth. The radio kept cutting out, turning to static every now and then. It was weird, but I figured it was just because I was so far from civilization. Still, something about that static felt off, almost like it was whispering. I ignored it. Then I passed this rusted old sign that read, "Safe Haven, 20 miles." It struck me as odd. Why would they put a sign for some place called Safe Haven out here in the middle of nothing? But I brushed it off and kept driving. That's when I saw him, just standing there on the shoulder, looking like a statue in my headlights. He wore a faded jacket and looked like he hadn't slept in days. My first thought was to keep going. Don't stop. But for some reason, I couldn't help myself. It felt like I had to pull over. Need a ride? I asked, leaning over the passenger seat. He nodded without a word and climbed in, his movement stiff and deliberate. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was headed, but he just gave these short, vague answers. Just passing through, he muttered, his voice low and flat. Something about the way he spoke made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced over and caught him staring at the glove compartment. Not just glancing, full-on staring, like he expected something to jump out. I cleared my throat, trying to shake the growing anxiety. So, you've been out here long? He turned to look at me, his eyes dark and intense. You've seen it too, right? What? My voice came out shaky. He didn't answer, just turned back to staring out the window. I didn't ask again. Minutes felt like hours. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I watched him out of the corner of my eye. Every now and then, he'd mumble something under his breath. Things like, "It's not safe," or "Don't look back." I was too scared to ask what he meant. I just needed to find a place to drop him off and get away. We came across a gas station, the only sign of life I'd seen in miles. I pulled in, relieved to see lights and a clerk inside. The hitchhiker's demeanor changed instantly. He started breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the parking lot like he was expecting something terrible to happen. "It's here," he whispered. "It's here." Before I could say anything, he threw the door open and ran. I got out, calling after him, but he disappeared around the corner of the building. I chased him, but it was like he vanished into thin air. There was no trace of him anywhere. No footprints. Nothing. Confused and freaked out, I walked back to the gas station. The clerk looked up as I came in, frowning. "Everything okay?" "Did you see where the guy I was with went?" I asked, still catching my breath. He gave me this blank look. "What guy?" "The guy. I just gave him a ride." "He was in the car with me." "Dude," the clerk said slowly, "I saw you pull in alone." My heart dropped. I stumbled back outside and looked around, half expecting the hitchhiker to come out of hiding. But there was no one. It was just me and my car. I got in, hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. Was I losing it? Imagining things? I had to get out of there. I drove for what felt like forever, every nerve in my body on edge. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, just a misunderstanding. Then I glanced over at the passenger seat. His jacket was there. The same faded jacket I'd seen him wearing when I picked him up. My breath hitched. I swerved to the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. How did it get here? I grabbed the jacket, my heart pounding in my ears, and noticed something crumpled in the pocket, a piece of paper. Unfolding it, I saw a series of coordinates scrawled in shaky handwriting. What the hell? Without thinking, I punched the coordinates into my GPS. It led me to a desolate rest area, miles off the main road. The place looked abandoned, cracked pavement, weeds sprouting through the concrete. There was an old bulletin board near the entrance, and something stapled to it caught my eye. A missing person poster. The hitchhiker's face stared back at me, grainy and faded. My blood ran cold. "Missing since 3 weeks ago," it read. Underneath, in messy handwriting, someone had written, "Don't pick up strangers." I backed away, heart hammering, and nearly tripped over my own feet. I ran back to my car and sped out of there, not daring to look back. The headlights flickered as I drove, and I swear I heard a faint tapping sound from the back seat. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. I didn't stop until I reached a small town. I pulled into the first well-lit diner I saw, parked, and just sat there, shaking. I pulled out my phone. Missed calls from an unknown number. My voicemail had one new message. I played it, and a voice that sounded eerily familiar whispered through the static. "It's not safe to be alone." I deleted it immediately, my hands trembling. I don't know what happened that night or if I'll ever really understand it. But if you ever find yourself driving down Route 39 late at night and you see someone on the side of the road, keep driving. The Voice in the Woods. I never thought I'd be writing something like this. I've been camping solo for years, and I've always scoffed at people who talk about getting scared out in the wilderness. But after what happened last weekend, I'm not sure if I'll ever go camping alone again. I'm not even sure I'll be able to sleep without a weapon next to my bed. It was supposed to be a relaxing short trip, 2 nights in a secluded spot I'd been to once before. The forest was remote, but that's what I liked about it. When I arrived, everything felt different. The air was heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. No animals were around. Usually I'd hear birds or see small critters scurrying about, but there was nothing. I set up camp, trying to ignore the weird feeling. As I was putting up my tent, I noticed a small pile of leaves that looked out of place, like they'd been gathered deliberately. Probably just the wind, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I was woken up by a soft sound, whispering. At first, I thought it was just the breeze rustling through the trees, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I lay there, listening, straining to make out the words, but they were too faint. "It's just your imagination," I muttered to myself. Eventually, the whispers faded, and I managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I found fresh footprints around my tent. They were light, like someone had been tiptoeing, and they led straight into the woods. There were no returning tracks. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it must have been another hiker passing through. But I knew that wasn't likely. This area is so remote that I've never seen another person here. I shook it off and spent the day hiking, hoping some fresh air and exercise would clear my head. That night, the whisper started again. This time, they were louder. I sat up, gripping my flashlight, pointing it at the tree line. Nothing. But the voices were closer now, and they weren't faint like before. It sounded like two people having a conversation, but I couldn't make out a single word. I forced myself to stay calm. "Wind. Just the wind," I whispered. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I decided to leave. I'd had enough. I packed up quickly and headed to my car, only to find all 4 tires slashed. Panic surged through me. This was no accident. Someone was out here, watching me, messing with me. I pulled out my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I was stranded. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Trying to stay calm, I grabbed my hunting knife from my bag and got into the car, locking the doors. I'd wait until morning and figure out a plan. The whispers returned that night, louder, closer. I could almost make out words, but they sounded garbled, like they were speaking through water. I squeezed the knife so hard my knuckles turned white, flinching at every creak and rustle. Hours passed like this, just me, clutching the knife, staring out into the dark woods. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A deliberate, slow knock on my window. I held my breath, frozen. I didn't dare look. My mind screamed at me to turn the car on, drive on the rims if I had to. But I couldn't move. When I finally gathered the courage to peek out the window, no one was there. But I knew someone had been. My only comfort was that dawn was coming. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my backpack and set out on foot. I knew there was a ranger station about 15 miles away. I just had to make it there. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. But every time I turned, I saw nothing. Then I started finding things on the trail. My spare flashlight, smashed. My canteen, dented. And worst of all, a photo of me, taken from behind, clearly from the night before. My legs almost gave out. Someone had been right there, watching me. Maybe even standing behind me while I sat by the fire, oblivious. I pushed forward, fear and adrenaline numbing me. I was sure I was being followed, but every time I stopped to listen, there was only silence. No birds, no wind, just that oppressive quiet. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a small clearing. An old abandoned cabin stood at the center, its windows broken, door ajar. As I approached, I heard the voice again, clear, close, but this time, it was my own voice, whispering from inside the cabin. I turned and ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to grab at my feet. I tripped, fell hard, and felt a sharp pain shoot through my ankle. I bit back a scream and crawled to a small crevice between some rocks. I squeezed myself in, trembling, trying to make myself as small as possible. Night fell, and I lay there, every muscle aching, every sound amplified in the silence. I heard soft footsteps approaching my hiding spot, then stopping. I held my breath, tears streaming down my face. They stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, silence. I stayed in that crevice until dawn. Somehow, I made it out of the woods. I don't remember much, just staggering onto a main road, dehydrated and delirious. A couple found me and took me to the nearest town. I didn't tell them everything. How could I? I'm not sure I even believe it myself. I've locked every door and window in my house since I got back. I haven't slept properly. Every time I close my eyes, I hear those whispers, see those footprints, feel those eyes on me. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I'll never go camping alone again. If you hear whispers in the woods, don't try to find out what's making them. Just leave. I was lucky. Next time, I won't be. The unfinished conversation. I'm not the type of person to share personal stuff online, but I'm honestly out of options. I need advice, or maybe just reassurance that I'm not overreacting. This whole thing started 2 weeks ago, and even now, I'm still questioning if I should have taken it more seriously from the beginning. For context, I'm in my early 30s, single, and work as a freelance graphic designer. I've lived in this small apartment for 3 years without any issues. It's a quiet area, no crime, no drama. My life was pretty uneventful until the phone calls started. It began with what I thought were wrong numbers, calls that would come in at random times during the day. They'd last for a few seconds of silence, then hang up. At first, I brushed it off. Probably a telemarketer or some kind of automated system glitch, right? But then the calls started coming in at odd hours, midnight, 3 a.m., even 5 in the morning. Each one lasted longer than the last, but there was never anyone on the other end. Just silence, sometimes followed by what sounded like faint breathing before the line cut off. The first time I felt real fear was about a week ago. It was 2 a.m. I remember being half asleep when my phone rang. I answered without thinking, annoyed and groggy. There was the usual silence, but then breathing, faint, steady, and too close to the receiver. I hung up immediately, my heart racing. That was when I knew it wasn't just a mistake. Someone was deliberately doing this. I decided to change my number the very next day, convinced that it would put an end to it. For a few days, everything seemed normal again. The calls stopped, and I felt a wave of relief. I told myself it was over, but, of course, it wasn't. The first call on my new number came 5 days later. It was 10:30 p.m. I stared at my phone, disbelief washing over me. There was no way anyone could have gotten my new number that fast. I answered, hoping for some explanation. Maybe it really was some kind of weird technical issue. Silence again. Then the call ended. That's when the paranoia set in. How did they get my new number? Was I being watched? I tried to ignore it, but the calls kept coming. Morning, afternoon, middle of the night. It didn't matter. Sometimes they were spaced hours apart. Other times, just minutes. They were relentless. The breaking point came during lunch with a friend. I got a call while we were talking. I didn't answer, but she noticed my reaction. "Are you okay? You've been so jumpy lately." I shrugged it off, saying it was just some spam calls, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. How could I explain that someone, somewhere, knew my every move? Then, one night, the call came again. I was prepared to ignore it, but something made me pick up. There was silence as usual, but then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so quiet I almost thought I imagined it, but it was there. My name, spoken softly. "Emma." The line went dead before I could react. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't random. Whoever it was, they knew me. They knew my name, my number, and maybe even where I lived. I contacted the phone company, but they couldn't help. The number was untraceable, probably a disposable one. The police took a report, but without any physical threats or evidence, there was little they could do. I tried to carry on like normal, but everything felt off. Little things in my apartment started to bother me. My keys weren't where I left them. The door was unlocked one morning, and I started seeing unfamiliar cars parked outside my building. I documented every call, every odd thing I noticed, but there was no clear pattern. I felt like I was losing my mind. Friends offered to stay over, but I didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess. I considered installing security cameras, but the thought made me sick. What if it provoked the caller? What if I saw something I didn't want to see? The calls continued. Now, there were background noises, traffic sounds, distant voices, sometimes music playing softly. I started to believe that the person was calling me from nearby, close enough that I could almost hear the world around them. Then, one night, I heard a knock at my door. 3 soft taps, almost polite. My body froze. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, willing myself to be invisible. My phone buzzed in my hand. I glanced down at the screen. "Why won't you answer?" I don't remember how long I stood there, paralyzed, before I finally moved. I stayed at a friend's house for the next few days, too afraid to go back. I bought a security system and installed cameras around my place, but even then, the calls didn't stop. It didn't matter where I was, they followed me. I knew then that I was being watched. A few nights later, I reviewed the camera footage. Everything seemed normal until around 3 a.m. A shadow moved past my living room window. It was quick, almost a blur, but it paused for a moment before disappearing. I rewound it over and over, feeling a deep sense of dread. That night, I received the final call. I almost didn't answer, but my hand moved on its own. Silence, then breathing, and finally, a voice, low and steady. "This isn't over." The call cut off. I dialed back immediately, but the number was out of service. The call stopped after that. No more knocks, no more shadows, just silence. I moved to a new apartment, took time off work, tried to rebuild my life. But every unknown number, every unexpected noise sends me spiraling. A month later, I got a text. No sender ID, no traceable number. Just 2 words. "Found you." I dropped the phone. I'm living on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next call that may never come. Maybe it's really over, but deep down, I know it's not. The scariest monsters are real people, and they don't need a reason to haunt you. Title: The Night I Spent at an Out of Town Motel and Why I'll Never Do That Again. I've been wanting to share this story for a while now, hoping it might serve as a warning to anyone else who finds themselves in a situation like mine. It happened a few years back, but I still can't shake off the feeling it left me with. I travel a lot for work, often driving late into the night to find the cheapest motels off the main highways. I'm no stranger to sketchy places, but I usually just lock my door and get through the night. That night, however, was different. I had driven longer than usual, and when I couldn't find a room anywhere nearby, I ended up at a small, run-down motel way off the beaten path. There was only one other car in the parking lot, and the place looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. I should have trusted my gut and kept driving, but I was too tired to argue with myself. I pulled up and checked in with a receptionist who seemed too cheerful for that hour. His smile was stretched tight, his eyes never quite meeting mine. He made a point to ask, "You're staying alone, right?" It didn't seem odd at first, but the way he glanced at the empty parking lot as he said it made my skin prickle. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my exhaustion. Once I got to my room, a faint, musty odor hit me. It wasn't unbearable, but enough to make me pause. The furniture looked old, and there was a drawer slightly open, as if someone had been in a hurry. I ignored it, figuring it was just a sign of a lazy cleaning job. The towels on the bathroom rack weren't folded neatly. One was draped over the edge like someone had just used it. I settled onto the bed, telling myself I was overthinking things. I turned on the TV to distract myself, but couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling. That's when I noticed it. A shadow shifting outside my window, pausing just behind the thin curtain. My heart pounded. I stood and pulled the curtain back, but there was no one there, just an empty parking lot. Still, I could swear I'd seen someone. Then I heard it. Soft, faint footsteps outside my door. I moved quietly to the peephole and held my breath. A blurry figure paused in front of my room. I couldn't make out the details, but I saw their head tilt, as if listening. I stumbled back, double-checking that the locks were secure. After a few minutes of silence, I dared to peek again. This time, I caught a glimpse of someone standing in the window of the room opposite mine, staring straight at me. They drew the curtain shut the moment I saw them. I didn't sleep. I stayed on edge, listening to every creak and shuffle, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. Just as I started convincing myself I was being paranoid, I heard soft, scratching sounds from the room next door, followed by hushed whispers. I strained to hear, but could only catch fragments. It didn't make any sense. That's when I realized the voice I was hearing was saying, "He's awake." I decided to call the front desk, just to be safe. The receptionist answered on the first ring, his voice calm and steady. I told him I thought I heard something strange, maybe someone outside my room. "Oh, you're the only guest tonight. No one else is staying here," he said, almost too casually. "But I saw someone in the room across from mine," I replied, my voice shaking. "No, you're mistaken. Everything is fine. Just try to get some rest," he said, and then hung up before I could respond. Something was very wrong. I checked my phone, but there was barely any signal. No Wi-Fi, no way to contact anyone else. I was completely alone. I crouched by the door, peeking through the peephole again. Shadows moved past, just like before, but this time they were slower, lingering. I held my breath, watching as a figure stopped directly outside, unmoving, then slowly leaned forward as if pressing their ear to the door. I turned off the lights, retreating into the corner of the room. I didn't know what to do. Through the gap in the curtain, I could make out shapes, people standing still, all looking at my window. I counted at least 4 or 5 of them. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, deciding to get the hell out of there. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I froze. A group of people stood at the far end, motionless, their faces blank. I took a step back, and they all turned toward me, as if on cue. It wasn't natural, the way they moved, the way they watched. Panicking, I sprinted down the hall. The people didn't chase me but started walking in my direction, not running, just keeping pace. I tried the doors I passed, but they were all locked. When I reached the lobby, I found it empty. No receptionist, no staff, just a note on the counter. Stay in your room, it's for your own good. My hand shook as I pushed through the emergency exit and found myself outside. The parking lot was empty except for the same people now standing in a row at the motel entrance. They didn't move or say a word, just watched as I ran to my car. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles away. I sat there, shaking, trying to piece together what had happened. A few days later, I told the story to a friend. That night, I got an email with a link. It was a trailer for a low-budget horror film. The motel was unmistakable, the scene almost identical to what I'd experienced. But what made my blood run cold was the people in the trailer. They were the same ones I'd seen at the motel, their faces exactly as I remembered. I tried reaching out to the filmmakers, but my messages went unanswered. The website for the film vanished a week later. To this day, I check every room thoroughly when I stay at a motel. I look at every corner, every mirror, and listen for the slightest sound. Because I can't shake the thought, what if it wasn't a film? What if I was being watched for a different reason? The noises in the basement. I moved into this old apartment complex a few months ago after graduating college. It wasn't anything special, small, a little run down, but it was cheap and close to my new job. The building felt safe enough, and the landlord seemed nice, though a bit dismissive. He told me the basement was off limits for tenants, saying it was just used for storage. I didn't think much of it at the time. For the first couple of weeks, everything was normal. My apartment was quiet, and the neighbors were friendly. Occasionally, I'd hear some odd noises, creaking pipes or faint thuds, but I brushed them off as just the sounds of an old building settling. One evening, while watching TV, I heard a loud thud from the basement. It was so sudden that I jumped up from the couch, my heart racing. The noise was followed by a series of soft, irregular thumps. It sounded almost like footsteps, but I convinced myself it was probably just the plumbing acting up again. I debated calling the landlord, but I didn't want to seem like a nuisance, so I let it go. I went to bed but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to sleep, but at around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint scraping noise, like something was being dragged across the basement floor. I held my breath, listening intently, but then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and oppressive. I eventually fell back asleep, telling myself I was overreacting. The next day, I noticed something strange. A faint smell of cigarettes wafted through the vents, which was odd since smoking was prohibited in the building. I asked a couple of my neighbors if they'd noticed the smell, but they looked at me like I was imagining things. Maybe I was. That evening, I decided to go down to the basement and check things out for myself. I waited until most people were out, feeling stupid for being so paranoid. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the narrow stairwell, each step echoing loudly. When I reached the basement door, I saw it was slightly ajar. My pulse quickened. I nudged the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty and thick, and I could barely see anything beyond the faint beam of my flashlight. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and dusty storage boxes. I moved slowly, trying not to make any noise. Then I saw it. Tucked behind an old boiler, there was a small, makeshift sleeping area. A tattered sleeping bag, some empty food cans, a flashlight, and a crumpled pack of cigarettes. I froze. Someone had been staying down here. Panicking, I backed out of the basement and rushed to the landlord's office. He listened as I tried to explain what I found, but he waved it off, saying it was probably just stuff left behind by an old tenant. "There's no way anyone's living down there," he said casually, like it was no big deal. I didn't feel reassured. From then on, I kept my door locked and bolted at all times, but the noises didn't stop. Over the next few nights, I heard soft murmurs, dragging sounds, and what even sounded like coughing. I barely slept. My mind was constantly on edge, listening for the slightest noise. I tried talking to a few neighbors again, but no one else seemed to hear anything. Was I going crazy? One night, I came home late after staying at a friend's place, hoping to avoid another night of anxiety. As I approached the building, I glanced over at the basement stairs and saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure standing at the top of the stairs. I blinked, and they were gone. I stood there, staring at the empty space, wondering if I'd really seen someone or if it was just my imagination. I forced myself to go inside, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. The next morning, I decided I needed proof. I went back down to the basement, flashlight in hand. This time, I was determined not to leave until I knew what was going on. As soon as I stepped in, I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the corner. I turned, and there he was, a man, hunched over, his face hidden beneath a hood. He didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He stood up suddenly, towering over me. My heart pounded as he sprinted past, knocking over boxes and disappearing out the basement door. I stood there frozen until I heard the door slam shut. It was only then that I ran, out of the basement, out of the building, and straight to my car. I called the police. They came and searched the basement, but he was long gone. There was no evidence, no sign anyone had been living there, just a few scattered items I'd seen before. They told me there had been reports of break-ins in the area, but nothing concrete to go on. I felt both validated and terrified. Whoever he was, he knew I knew about him now. I moved out of the apartment within a week, breaking the lease and losing my deposit. I told myself it was worth it for peace of mind. I tried to put it behind me, but the image of that man standing in the basement haunted me. A few months later, a friend called to tell me that someone had been arrested in my old building. The description matched the man I'd seen: tall, thin, wearing a hood. He was a wanted fugitive, linked to several violent crimes. I looked up his arrest online and found a grainy photo of him being led away in handcuffs. His eyes were cold and hollow. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. How many nights did he spend just a few feet below me, watching and waiting? Even now, I can't stop thinking about it. What if I hadn't moved out when I did? What if he hadn't run that day? Did he really leave, or is he out there somewhere, waiting for his next chance? Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear those faint, irregular thumps, just like the noises in the basement. The stalker at the cafe. I used to love going to the small cafe around the corner from my apartment. It was my little escape, somewhere I could sit quietly with a book and a latte, pretending I had no worries in the world. I liked the familiarity of it. The baristas knew me by name, and I'd even recognize some regulars who shared the same routine. A few months ago, though, I started noticing something different. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when it began, but there was a shift in how I felt being there. At first, it was just a vague discomfort. Maybe it was the new barista who seemed to watch me a little too intently, or the way the noise level in the cafe seemed louder than usual. Then, I noticed him. He was just another customer, mid-30s, average build, nothing particularly striking about him. But what caught my attention was how he'd always sit in the same corner, facing me. his eyes never straying. The first time, I thought it was just a coincidence. By the third time, I was unsettled. I brushed it off, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. After all, it's a public place. People watch each other. No big deal, right? But it didn't stop. He was always there, and he was always watching. I tried changing my seat, hoping it would disrupt his pattern. Instead, he shifted too. He moved to a new spot, directly in my line of sight. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I packed up early that day, not bothering to finish my coffee. My fingers trembled as I threw on my coat, feeling his gaze follow me out the door. That evening, on my way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I glanced over my shoulder multiple times, but there was no one there. Still, I practically ran to my building, feeling foolish for getting so worked up. A few days later, I stopped going to the cafe altogether. I didn't want to see him anymore, and I figured that would be the end of it. Except it wasn't. I started seeing him in places that he shouldn't be. Once I spotted him standing across the street from my office. Another time, he was on the same bus I occasionally took to visit my friend. Each time, I tried to convince myself it was just bad luck. It's a small city. People cross paths. Then, the notes started. At first, I thought it was a prank, someone at work messing around. A small piece of paper folded neatly in my mailbox. See you soon. I tossed it, not wanting to dwell on what it meant. But they kept coming. Nice dress today. You look tired this morning. My hands would shake as I unfolded each one, reading them over and over, hoping to find some clue about who was leaving them. I told the building manager, but without any evidence, there was nothing they could do. I debated going to the police, but what would I say? There's this guy I see sometimes and some creepy notes. They'd probably think I was crazy. One day, I resolved to confront him. I had to take control somehow, stop feeling like a victim. I sat at a park bench, scanning the area. Sure enough, there he was, lingering just within eyesight. I stood up, my heart pounding, and started walking toward him. But as soon as I moved, he turned and melted into the crowd, as if he knew I was coming. I felt so helpless, standing there alone, watching him disappear. It was like he was toying with me, always one step ahead. After that, I barely slept. My eyes were always scanning, searching for signs that he was nearby. One evening, after seeing him 3 times in different parts of the city, I called my friend, desperate for help. We arranged to meet at a cafe downtown. I didn't want to be alone. As I waited, I saw him again, standing at the corner, looking right at me. For the first time, I felt a surge of anger and fear mixed with something else, determination. I didn't want him to follow me to my friend, so I bolted, running down the opposite street. I heard footsteps behind me, steady and controlled. I ducked into alleys and zigzagged through side streets, my breath coming out in harsh gasps. He was relentless, always right behind me. I stumbled into a convenience store, panting and desperate. The cashier looked up, startled. "Please, call the police," I begged, my voice shaking. Before I could say more, the door chimed. He walked in calmly, as if he hadn't been chasing me just moments ago. He stared at me, and a smile, barely there, curved his lips. The cashier looked between us, unsure of what was happening. "Is there a problem here?" the cashier asked. The man didn't say a word. He just shook his head, turned, and left. I crumpled against the counter, trying to make sense of it. Why didn't he do anything? Why did he just leave like that? The police arrived soon after, but there was nothing they could do. They took my statement, gave me the usual advice. Change your routine. Don't walk alone at night. I stayed at a friend's place for a few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. One morning, I returned to my apartment, thinking I was ready to face my life again. There was another note waiting for me. I didn't open it right away. I knew what it would say. I'll always be watching. I moved to a new city not long after that. I found a new job, made new friends. For a while, I thought I was finally free. But sometimes, I still catch a glimpse of someone familiar in a crowd, or feel eyes on me in a way that makes my skin crawl. I can't prove he's still following me, but I don't think I'll ever really escape him. If you think someone's watching you, they probably are. Stay safe. Title: I thought I was escaping danger, but I ran straight into something worse. I've never shared this before, but after reading a few posts here, I feel like I have to get it out. This happened a few months ago, and I'm still trying to process it. Writing it down might help me make sense of it. So here goes. I'm a young woman living alone in a quiet neighborhood. It's one of those places where nothing ever really happens, so I always felt safe walking home after my late shifts at work. But everything changed one night. Now, I can't shake this constant sense of dread. I'm terrified to leave my apartment, and I've barely slept since. It started with something small. One evening, as I was walking home, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I got home and noticed a van parked a few houses down the street. Its windows were dark, and it looked a little out of place. I assumed it belonged to someone visiting a neighbor and thought nothing more of it. The next night, as I left work, I saw the same van parked a few blocks away. A weird feeling hit me, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. It was a popular make and model. Lots of people drive similar vans. I tried not to overthink it. But then, as I walked, I heard the low hum of an engine behind me. I turned, and sure enough, the van was moving slowly, keeping a steady distance. My heart began to race, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I changed my path, taking an unexpected left turn. The van turned too. Panic started to creep in. I tried another turn. The van followed. It was no longer a coincidence. Someone was deliberately following me, and I was still over 10 minutes from home. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but I couldn't even type the numbers correctly. I tried crossing the street suddenly, but the van mirrored my movements. I felt trapped. I ducked into a small convenience store, hoping the driver would get bored and move on if I stayed inside for a bit. I stood by the window, pretending to browse, but my eyes kept darting outside. The van pulled up right in front of the store. It was waiting. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to act. I bolted out of the store, sprinting down the street. The sound of tires screeching behind me echoed in the empty street as the van sped up, following me. I didn't know where to go. I turned sharply down alleyways and side streets, trying to lose them. My chest burned, my legs ached, but the van stayed on my tail, engine roaring louder every second. Desperate, I spotted a house with its lights on. I ran up the steps and pounded on the door, screaming for help. I could see the van pulling up, the headlights glaring at me. A man in his 60s opened the door, eyes wide in shock. I tumbled inside as he closed the door quickly behind me, locking it. "Are you okay? What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm, almost soothing. I was gasping, tears streaming down my face. Someone's following me," I managed to choke out. He nodded, giving me a glass of water. "You're safe now. I saw the van too. Don't worry, I'll call the police." I collapsed onto the couch, shivering. "Thank you. Thank you so much," I whispered. He smiled, but something about it seemed off. He didn't reach for a phone. I glanced around. No landline, no cell phone in sight. "When are the police coming?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll take care of everything," he replied, still smiling. My unease grew. He began asking strange questions. Did anyone else know I was here? Was I close to my family? Did I usually walk home alone? Every question made my skin crawl. I told myself I was overreacting, but alarm bells were ringing in my head. I should probably go, I stammered, standing up. I think I'll just walk home. Before I could take a step, he moved in front of me, blocking my path. His smile widened, his eyes narrowing. I don't think that's a good idea, he said softly. You're safe here. Why don't you stay a bit longer? Fear spiked through me. I had to get out. No, really, my boyfriend's waiting for me just around the corner, I lied, trying to sound convincing. His smile vanished. I thought you said you were alone, he muttered, stepping closer. My heart pounded. I shoved past him with all my strength, catching him off guard. He stumbled, and I grabbed the door handle, yanking it open. I didn't look back. I just ran. I heard him shouting after me, then heard a car engine roar to life. I glanced back. He was chasing me in a different car, headlights cutting through the darkness. Panic surged through me. I didn't know where to go, but I ran as fast as I could, not caring where my feet took me. That's when I saw the original van parked at the end of the street. It was a trap. The man from the house and the van driver, they were working together. I veered off the road, plunging into a thick patch of trees. The sound of their car skidding to a halt followed me. I kept running, branches scratching at my arms and face, until I finally collapsed behind a large tree, gasping for breath. I crouched there, trying to quiet my breathing. I could hear their voices, two male voices, arguing in the distance. They were looking for me. I stayed hidden, terrified, until I heard their cars drive off. When I was sure they were gone, I stumbled out of the woods and flagged down a passing car. An elderly woman picked me up and called the police. They searched the area, but there was no trace of the van or the man. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching. The police never found them, and every night I'm haunted by the thought that they might come back. So, if you ever feel like you're being followed, don't run into the first house you see. You might be escaping danger, but you never know who or what is waiting behind that door. The photographer. I've always considered myself to be a pretty cautious guy. I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, and I work a typical 9-to-5 job at a marketing firm. Most days I keep to myself, come home, maybe work on some personal projects, and go for a walk around the neighborhood to unwind. I guess you could say I'm a creature of habit. I've always been aware of my surroundings, especially when walking at night. I've seen my share of odd characters, but nothing too crazy, just city life. Still, a few things started happening that I brushed off at the time, but looking back, should have set off more alarm bells. It was small stuff at first. I'd catch what seemed like a shadow following me out of the corner of my eye, or hear faint footsteps behind me that would stop when I turned around. It was creepy, sure, but I just figured I was being paranoid. Then, one evening, my neighbor mentioned something strange. She said she saw me out with a friend the other night. I shrugged it off because I knew I'd been alone. Just another odd coincidence, I thought, until I got home that night and found an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a single photograph of me walking to work that morning, taken from behind. It was a close shot, like whoever took it was just a few feet away. My heart started pounding, but I convinced myself it had to be some kind of weird prank. The next day, I found another envelope in my mailbox. This time, it had 3 photos. One was of me standing at the bus stop, another of me looking at my phone in a cafe, and the last of me unlocking my apartment door. The angles were perfect, as if the person had been right next to me. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I went to the police, but they didn't take me seriously. It could be a joke, one officer said, or maybe someone with an odd sense of humor. Keep an eye out, but there's not much we can do. That night, I changed up my routine a bit. took a different bus, avoided my usual spots, even stayed in all day to see if it made any difference. When I finally stepped out to check my mailbox, I found another envelope. My hands were shaking as I opened it. There was only one photo inside. It showed me standing at my living room window earlier that morning, looking out into the street. The picture was taken from somewhere high up, maybe one of the buildings across the street. But the worst part? It was taken from inside my apartment building. My heart pounded as I looked around my empty living room, feeling exposed. Whoever it was, they had access. I called my landlord, insisting that we check the security footage. But nothing turned up. There was no sign of forced entry, and the cameras didn't show anyone unusual entering or leaving the building. Frustrated, I installed extra locks and set up a small security camera at my front door. But it didn't make me feel any safer. More photos arrived over the next few days. Each one was more invasive than the last. There were images of me on the couch, cooking in the kitchen, and one of me sleeping. Every angle suggested they were taken from inside my apartment, but there was no sign of anyone. I started losing sleep, double-checking every lock and corner of my place before going to bed. One weekend, I decided to get out of town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I booked a small hotel room in a town 2 hours away, thinking I could get some rest, some distance. When I got back on Sunday evening, I found another envelope. My hands trembled as I pulled out the photos inside. They showed me checking into the hotel, eating at a restaurant nearby, and sitting in the lobby reading a book. Whoever was doing this had followed me there. I was completely exposed. No matter where I went, they were always a step ahead. Then I noticed something different. One photo was of my apartment door, taken from inside. It was time-stamped from when I was away. I dropped the picture, my pulse racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I had to do something. I came up with a plan to catch them. I left my apartment that evening, locking up carefully and walking down the street, making sure I was seen leaving. But I didn't go far. I sneaked back up the emergency staircase and hid inside my bedroom closet, bat in hand. I waited. Hours passed. Then I heard it. A soft click and the creak of the front door opening. My pulse thundered in my ears as I peeked through the slats. A shadowy figure stood just inside the doorway, unmoving, almost savoring the moment. After what felt like an eternity, they stepped inside. I jumped out, yelling and swinging the bat wildly. The figure bolted, running out the door. I chased them down the hall, catching a glimpse of a hooded figure before they vanished down the stairs. The police came, but just like before, they found nothing. No evidence, no fingerprints, just a hollow feeling of helplessness. I went back to my apartment, shaken and exhausted. I collapsed onto the couch and closed my eyes. When I opened them, I saw it. Another photograph on my coffee table. It was a picture of me standing over the very spot where I'd been hiding, taken from the doorway. They knew I was there the whole time. I barely leave my apartment now. I've thought about moving or getting a dog, but I know it won't matter. They'd just find me again. The fear has swallowed my life. I skip work, avoid friends, and keep the blinds closed. Every sound makes me jump. Every knock on the door is a potential threat. One day, I noticed a new neighbor moving into the apartment across from mine. I peered through the peephole and saw them carrying a large box marked photography equipment. I didn't confront them. Weeks have gone by without any new photos, but I still feel those eyes on me. I tell myself it's over, but I know it's not. Not really. Sometimes I think I see a camera lens glinting through the curtains across the street, but that's probably just my imagination, right? The Forgotten Passenger. I've never really shared this with anyone, but maybe it's easier to put it here, where no one knows who I am. I used to work late nights, taking the last train home. It was my routine. I'd get to the station around 11:50 p.m., drained from another day of staring at screens and answering emails. The station would usually be filled with other exhausted commuters like me, but that night, something felt off. There were fewer people than usual, the lights were dimmer, and the entire place had this empty, hollow vibe. I noticed the clock on the wall. It was stuck at 11:57 p.m., the same time I'd arrived. It didn't budge even as the seconds dragged on. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe I was just more tired than usual. As I stood there, I noticed a man at the far end of the platform. He was staring down at the tracks, completely still. I thought he might be looking for something, but his posture made me uncomfortable, unnaturally stiff. And then I heard it. He was mumbling something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but it gave me chills. I shifted my weight, trying to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. When the train screeched into the station, startling everyone, the man didn't even flinch. Despite my unease, I boarded the train. The door slid shut with a heavy thud, and I made my way to the far end of the car. There were a few other regulars scattered around, all minding their own business. Just as I sat down, I saw the man step in at the last second. He took a seat at the opposite end, still muttering to himself. He never looked up. The train rolled forward. We passed a few stations. People got off, but the man stayed. I tried to ignore him, staring out the window at the empty, dark city blurring past. It wasn't until the train entered a long tunnel that everything changed. The lights flickered and went out completely for a moment. In that darkness, I heard it, a scream, loud and raw. It echoed through the car. I jerked up, heart pounding. I glanced around, expecting everyone to be on edge, but no one reacted. The only other passenger left, a middle-aged woman a few seats away, kept staring at her phone like nothing had happened. I turned to look at the man. He was perfectly still, staring down at his hands. He didn't move. He didn't even twitch. When the lights flickered back on, I scanned the car, half expecting chaos. But there was nothing. The train was silent except for the rhythmic clattering of the wheels. I blinked, trying to process what just happened. That scream had been real. I know I heard it. But then I looked again. He was gone. No coat, no bag, no trace that he was ever there. Panic began to bubble up. Had I imagined him? Had he really been there at all? My hands were shaking as I moved to a different seat, closer to the exit. The train finally emerged from the tunnel, but the unease didn't lift. I kept scanning the car, half expecting to see him somewhere, but I was alone with the woman. Then I noticed something even more terrifying. The train wasn't stopping at the next station. I stood up, heart racing. The lights dimmed again. The woman finally looked up and, without meeting my eyes, said, "You saw him too, didn't you?" Then she returned to her phone as if she hadn't said anything at all. My head spun. This wasn't right. I needed to get off. I moved towards the intercom, but it was dead. No conductor, no staff, no announcements. I banged on the door to the conductor's compartment, but no response. The train screeched to a sudden stop in the middle of nowhere at a dark, unfamiliar station. I hesitated, then bolted for the door. I needed to get off. I needed to feel solid ground under my feet again. But as soon as I stepped onto the platform, I realized I had no idea where I was. The station was deserted. No signs, no maps, no people. Just an eerie, oppressive silence. I turned back, but the train door slammed shut, and it sped off, leaving me stranded. Panic clawed at my throat. I was alone. I looked around, hoping to find an exit, but then I heard it. Soft footsteps echoing down the platform. I turned around, and there he was. The man was at the far end, staring at his hands again. He started walking toward me, his mumbling growing louder. I stumbled backward, searching for a way out. The staircases led nowhere. Every gate was locked. My voice caught in my throat as I tried to call for help. The sound was swallowed by the empty station. His mumbling grew louder, and I realized he was saying my name over and over again. I ran, finding a small maintenance door. I yanked it open and rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I waited, holding my breath. The silence stretched on. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard his voice, calm, almost amused. "You can't leave yet." I don't know how long I stayed in that room. When I finally opened the door, he was gone. The station was empty, completely silent. I checked my phone. It was 2 o'clock a.m. 2 hours had passed, but it felt like minutes. An empty train finally pulled up. I got on, desperate to leave. As it pulled away, I glanced at the window and froze. In the reflection, I saw myself, eyes wide and unblinking, lips moving silently. I looked just like him. I don't remember getting home. I'm here now, staring at my screen, typing this out, but everything's a blur. There's no mention of anything happening that night in the news. No incidents, no strange passengers. I don't know what's real anymore. Just now, I heard it again. A soft voice, whispering my name from the other side of the room. I turn around slowly, but there's no one there. The wrong delivery. I'm not the kind of person who usually gets freaked out. I live alone, I'm organized, and I don't scare easily. But a few weeks ago, something happened that's left me questioning everything I thought I knew. I'm not sure what I hope to achieve by sharing this here, but I guess I just want people to know what I went through and maybe get some advice or even just validation that I'm not losing my mind. It all started with a package I found on my porch one evening. I remember it so clearly because I hadn't ordered anything recently. I buy stuff online sometimes, but I always keep track of my orders. This box didn't have any return address or sender information, just my name and address on a plain white label. Curiosity got the better of me, and I brought it inside. Inside the box, I found some clothes. Nothing too fancy, just a couple of t-shirts and a pair of jeans. But they were exactly my size. I thought maybe someone had sent me a gift, but the feeling of unease grew as I dug deeper. There was a book on woodworking, something I'm interested in but never really told anyone about. And then, a photo slipped out from under the clothes. It was a picture of my favorite cafe, the one I go to almost every weekend. That's when my stomach dropped. I tried to reason it out. Someone must have sent this by mistake, or it was some weird coincidence. But that didn't explain the note I found tucked at the bottom of the box. 4 words written in neat handwriting. "See you soon." That was the moment I felt genuine fear. I immediately called the delivery company, but they had no record of the package. They suggested I was confusing it with another order. After hanging up, I sat there staring at the note. It felt like a message directed right at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I double-checked my doors and windows, locked everything, and sat on my couch, just listening to the silence around me. I convinced myself it was a prank, a cruel, elaborate prank. But in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't. Over the next few days, I couldn't get that package out of my head. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, avoiding my usual routines. I started taking different routes home from work, watching for any sign of being followed. Then, it happened again. More wrong deliveries started arriving. Small things at first. A book on a niche topic I love, a custom-made mug with my name on it. It was like someone was digging into my life, piece by piece. When I called the police, they brushed it off as a prank, telling me to ignore it. But how could I ignore it? Whoever was doing this knew too much about me. It felt like they were in my head. I changed all my passwords, set up security cameras around the house, but I never caught anyone. It was driving me insane. I even asked a few friends if they were playing some sort of joke on me, but their reactions told me they were as baffled as I was. One friend suggested I stay with them for a few days, but I stubbornly refused. I wasn't going to let some creep make me feel unsafe in my own home. One evening, I came back from work and immediately sensed something was off. My front door was slightly ajar. I know for a fact I had locked it before leaving. I walked in cautiously, my heart pounding. Nothing seemed out of place. No sign of a break-in. But then I saw it. A new package on the kitchen counter, already open. Inside was a framed photograph of me taken from outside through my living room window. I called the police again. They arrived, searched the place, but found no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence of anyone else being there. I was left standing in the middle of my living room, feeling more alone and exposed than ever. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to go to work. I called in sick and spent hours pacing around my house, barely sleeping. Every little sound made my skin crawl. I kept checking my security camera feed until my phone buzzed with a new notification. Movement detected. I opened the live feed and saw a shadowy figure standing at my front door. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen, I called the police yet again. The figure didn't move, just stood there, like they knew I was watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped outside, knife in hand, shouting for them to leave, but by the time I reached the door, they were gone. No footsteps, no sign of anyone ever being there. I was left trembling in my yard, the knife heavy in my hand. When I went back inside and slammed the door shut, I noticed a new piece of paper slipped under the door. Nice try. See you inside. The police arrived, but again, nothing. No prints, no evidence. I decided to leave town for a few days, staying with a friend, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I glanced at my phone or looked out a window, I felt eyes on me. Just when I thought I could start to relax, I found another note in my bag, one I hadn't packed. You can't hide. Weeks later, I returned home. The deliveries had stopped, and I tried to convince myself that it was finally over. But small things kept happening, objects moving slightly, a door I know I closed being open. I started doubting myself, thinking it was just paranoia. Then a final message appeared on my phone from an unknown number. Miss me? I deleted it immediately, but I knew the damage was done. No matter where I go or what I do, I'll never feel safe again. Title: The Hiker. I've never really shared this story before, but it's been eating away at me. It wasn't anything paranormal, no ghosts or monsters, just something far scarier, something human. I know that might not sound as frightening, but when you're out there in the middle of nowhere, with no one to turn to, that's when you realize how vulnerable you really are. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Tom, his girlfriend Lisa, and 2 other friends, Mark and Jenna. We'd done a few trails before, but this time we decided to venture into a remote mountain range. It wasn't on the usual maps, which made it even more appealing. No tourists, no noise, just us and nature. A park ranger had warned us to stick to the main trails, but we laughed it off, confident that we knew what we were doing. After all, we were experienced hikers. What could go wrong? The hike started off peaceful. The fresh mountain air, the breathtaking views. Everything was perfect. But after a few hours, I noticed something strange. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just my imagination. Now, looking back, I wish I'd paid more attention. We took a break near a clearing, and Tom decided to check out the trail ahead. "I'll be back in a few minutes," he said, and we watched him disappear into the trees. It was supposed to be a short scouting trip, but after 15 minutes, he still hadn't returned. We called out his name, but there was no response. Our voices seemed to bounce off the trees and vanish into the thick forest. An hour went by, no Tom. We started to worry. Mark suggested splitting up to cover more ground. Jenna and Lisa went one way, while Mark and I went the other. Every now and then we'd stop and shout his name, our voices sounding more desperate each time. I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. Something wasn't right. That's when Lisa swore she heard something, a faint whistle coming from the woods. We all froze, listening. It was soft, almost playful, and definitely not Tom's. We exchanged uneasy glances. Could it be another hiker? But why wouldn't they answer when we called out? We decided to head in the direction of the sound, hoping to find Tom or at least some sign of him. What we found instead was his backpack, dumped beside the trail. Everything inside had been pulled out and scattered around. Water bottles, snacks, his map, everything. The way it was arranged made my skin crawl. It didn't look like he just dropped it. It felt like someone had deliberately laid it out, piece by piece. But why? And who? The whistling started up again, coming from deeper in the woods. My heart raced. I glanced at Mark, and I could see the fear in his eyes too, but we couldn't leave Tom out there. We pushed forward, calling his name, though our voices now seemed tiny and pathetic against the vast, empty woods. Then, through the trees, we saw something red. Tom's jacket. Relief washed over us for a second, but it quickly turned to horror. The jacket was hanging on a branch, and there was no sign of Tom anywhere. It was like someone had placed it there, mocking us. The ground beneath it was muddy, and there, clear as day, was a footprint, but much larger than any of ours. We heard a twig snap directly behind us. We spun around. Nothing but trees. "Let's go back," Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. But where could we go? We were hours away from the nearest road, and it would be dark soon. We decided to set up a small camp, build a fire, and wait for morning. It felt like our only option. That night was the longest of my life. We sat around the fire, barely speaking, straining to hear any sound over the crackling flames. And then we heard it again. The whistle, louder this time, closer. My grip tightened around a branch I'd picked up, like it could actually protect me. The footsteps started soon after, soft at first, but steadily growing nearer. Someone was out there, circling us. The firelight cast long shadows, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see someone or something standing just beyond the light. We huddled together, trying to stay calm, when suddenly Lisa let out a blood-curdling scream. I turned just in time to see a figure dart out of the shadows and grab her. I lunged forward, but something struck the back of my head, hard. Everything went black. I woke up alone, my head pounding and the taste of blood in my mouth. My clothes were torn, and I was covered in cuts and bruises. There was no sign of the others. Panicking, I staggered to my feet, calling their names, but the woods were silent once more. I stumbled back to where we'd found Tom's backpack, hoping it was all some terrible nightmare. It wasn't. Tom's body was hanging from the tree now, his face twisted in terror. A note was pinned to his chest. Too late. He was first. I collapsed to my knees, sobbing. My friends were gone. Tom was dead, and I was completely alone. Then I noticed a fresh message at the bottom of the note. "Now it's your turn." I ran. I don't know how long I stumbled through the woods, screaming for help, tripping over roots and branches. I felt like I was being watched, stalked, every step of the way. I finally broke through the tree line and saw the parking lot. I sprinted toward the car, glancing back once, expecting to see that figure chasing me. But there was nothing, just the quiet woods behind me. I jumped into the car and sped off, my hands trembling so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. We never found the others. I told the police everything, but they said there was no evidence, no sign of anyone else in those woods. I've tried to move on, but every so often I hear it. That damn whistle, just outside my window. It's followed me home. I still don't know who or what was out there in those woods. But sometimes, when the wind's just right, I swear I hear that damn whistle again, like it's calling me back. The babysitter's nightmare. I used to think babysitting was an easy way to earn some extra cash. Watch TV, feed the kids, and get them to bed. But then there was the Swanson job. I took it because the money was good, and it was in a nice neighborhood. Big, quiet houses with well-kept lawns. It seemed like an ideal gig. The Swansons were a well-off couple with 2 kids, Jamie, 5, and Ella, 3. Mrs. Swanson had a polite but distant air, like she didn't quite trust me yet. Mr. Swanson barely said a word, which felt a bit strange, but I brushed it off. Their house was beautiful but old. High ceilings, wooden floors that creaked if you stepped too hard, and rooms that seemed a little too dim even when all the lights were on. The first night went smoothly enough. I put Jamie and Ella to bed, and the rest of the evening was quiet. Around 9 p.m., I settled on the couch, ready to start on my homework. That's when I thought I heard something, just a faint noise like a chair scraping upstairs. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling. As I was getting ready to leave, I noticed something odd. There was a small porcelain doll on the living room shelf. I didn't remember seeing it before, but I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd just missed it earlier, but it left me with a strange, uneasy feeling as I locked up and left for the night. The next time I came over, things started to feel wrong. It was small stuff at first. A chair was slightly pulled out from the table when I knew I'd pushed it in. A kitchen cabinet left ajar. The lights in the hallway seemed dimmer than before. It felt like someone else was moving things around when I wasn't looking. Jamie and Ella were different too. They were more quiet, sticking close to each other and jumping at small noises. When I suggested we play in the playroom upstairs, Jamie just shook his head and said, "Not there." When I asked why, he whispered, "Don't let the man see you." I froze for a second, not sure what to say. It was probably just something he'd seen on TV or overheard, but it left me with a knot in my stomach. When the Swansons came home that night, I mentioned Jamie's comment. Mrs. Swanson laughed nervously, saying Jamie had an overactive imagination, but she didn't look at me when she said it. There was something off about her reaction, like she wasn't as surprised as she should have been. The next morning, I got a text from Mrs. Swanson. She apologized for not telling me earlier that the attic door sometimes creaked open by itself. "Old latch," she said. I didn't know why she felt the need to explain that. It wasn't like I'd mentioned the attic door. The text felt off, like she was warning me. Things escalated from there. The kids were more on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, especially at night. The worst was when I started hearing noises coming from the attic. They were faint, like someone moving slowly, carefully. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. One night, I decided I had to check it out. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. With my phone's flashlight in one hand, I climbed the attic stairs slowly, each creak of the wood sounding unnaturally loud. The attic was empty, just dusty old boxes and cobwebs. But there, in the corner, was a single small footprint in the dust, smaller than mine, but too big to belong to a child. I hurried back downstairs, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to freak out in front of the kids. That night, I decided to stay in the living room instead of the guest bedroom. I needed to be close to the kids, just in case. I tried to stay awake, listening for any noise, Around 2 a.m., I heard it, the creak of the attic door opening slowly. Then, the soft sound of footsteps descending the stairs. I couldn't breathe. I stayed absolutely still, clutching my phone. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that whoever it was would just go away. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, the sound of the front door opening and closing broke the silence. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I was ready to tell the Swansons I couldn't do this anymore. But before I could say anything, they said they were running late and left in a rush. I was alone with the kids again. That night, when the footsteps came back, I grabbed Jamie and Ella and locked us all in the master bedroom. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, whispering my address and telling the operator that there was someone in the house. The kids were clinging to me, tears in their eyes. When the police arrived, I ran downstairs to open the door. They moved through the house, checking every room. "Clear!" one officer called out from the kitchen. "Clear!" another shouted from the guest bedroom. But when they got to the attic, they stopped. "There's no one here," the officer said, turning to me. "But does anyone else live in this house?" I shook my head, confused. "No, just the Swansons and the kids." He looked at me seriously. "Then why is there a mattress and empty food wrappers up there?" I quit the next day. The Swansons acted shocked, apologizing profusely and saying they had no idea. Mrs. Swanson even offered to pay me more, but I refused. I needed to get away from that house. A few days later, I got a text from an unknown number. "You're lucky you left when you did." I don't know who sent it, and I don't want to know. I moved out of town trying to put the whole thing behind me, but it's hard. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up, convinced I hear faint footsteps above my head.